Chapter 4. Changes in Society. We have seen that 3GW or maneuver warfare really started in 1915 and came to maturity in 1940. The previous chapters have also shown that major changes in warfare were always preceded by changes in the political, economic, social, and technical segments of society. Given that changes in these areas are apparent precursors to changes in warfare, we have to ask if the changes in society since the evolution of the third generation are sufficient to indicate that it is time for the fourth generation. We know it took about 100 years to move from the height of 1GW conflict, as represented by the Napoleonic Wars, to 2GW conflict, as represented by World War I. It required that long for society to develop the industrial, societal, and technical base to support the huge armies during a 4-year struggle. We also know that although all the tactical elements of 3GW war were present in World War I, it required the 21 years between World War I and World War II for society to develop the base required to generate full-fledged maneuver war, 3GW. Therefore, to explore the possibility that 4GW is evolving, the logical period to examine for political, economic, social, and technical changes is the time between the start of World War II and today. Obviously, a single chapter cannot begin to provide a definitive list of the enormous societal changes since that time. However, this chapter provides an abbreviated listing of some of the key changes. It is designed to stimulate thought concerning the breadth and types of changes in society since the 1940s, and lead the reader to consider how those changes have affected warfare during the same period. Politically, there have been extensive changes since the end of World War II. The most obvious is the exponential increase in the number of players on the international stage. Prior to the war, the nation-state was the only significant player on the international scene. Immediately after the war, both the political and economic spheres began changing rapidly, and each added numerous and varied players to the political stage. The most obvious change in the political scene was the creation and growth of international organizations. The first was the United Nations. It provided an international forum that had been lacking and was the precursor for numerous other international organizations. While it had little real power, the United Nations was immediately a part of any international political struggle. Initially, one of its prime functions was to provide an appearance of international approval for action taken in defense of both national and international interests, primarily of Western powers. However, as the United Nations expanded to include an ever-increasing number of Third World nations, it became an effective place for those nations to express their disapproval of the actions of Western powers, in particular the United States. Further, the United Nations was only the first of a series of international organizations that now have significant impact on the negotiations and relations between nations. The United Nations alone has given birth to the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the International Atomic Energy Agency. Each of these international agencies infringes on national sovereignty in one way or another. Nations are no longer free to set their own tariffs, their own interest rates, their own safety standards, their own construction standards, and so on. These basic elements of national sovereignty were considered integral to a nation-state's power prior to World War II. Although the enforcement power of these bodies is sharply limited by the nature of the United Nations, we should not underestimate the influence they have through their member nations. Although the United Nations as a whole may not use military force to punish those who transgress, individual states certainly express their disapproval in the political, economic, social, and even technical realms. A pariah state suffers from reduced contact in all areas. This translates into direct economic harm and may even lead to changed behavior. Although the final causes of South Africa's transition to a majority black government are varied, its status as an outcast in the international community undoubtedly had significant impact. In a similar vein, subordinate organizations of the United Nations and other independent international organizations, such as the World Trade Organization, WTO, have a major impact on the actions of nations. Membership in the WTO or attempts to join it require nations to yield power concerning labor and trade practices. They must meet international standards that prior to World War II were mostly internal matters. Today, the World Bank can demand that nations comply with their recommendations on interest rates, internal distribution of funds, and international borrowing if they wish to continue receiving international funds. Parallel to the growth of worldwide organizations, we have seen the growth of numerous regional organizations that place real limits on the powers of sovereign nations. Even the United States is not immune to their power. Witness the impact of the North American Free Trade Association, NAFTA, on political and economic policies internal to our country. The European Union has an even greater impact on member nations than NAFTA has on its members. Similar regional organizations with varying degrees of power are now present throughout the world. The second major change in the political structure was the huge increase in the number and diversity of nations. The post-war breakup of the European colonial empires gave birth to dozens of new nations, all theoretically equal partners in the United Nations. As a rough measure of the increase in players, the United Nations had 51 members when the Charter was originally signed in 1945. It now has 189 member states. The proliferation of states and their varying stages of development create a complexity in international relations that did not exist before 1945. In 1945, the 51 nations were mostly political entities of long-standing the majority in the developed world. In contrast, the vast majority of the states that have joined since then are new nations, many artificially created by a colonial power. These nations naturally have different needs, concerns, and motivations than do developed nations of long standing. The third significant change is the number of stateless actors that influence the international scene. These include both transnational and subnational elements. On the transnational level, the players are numerous. They range from peaceful transnational movements such as Greenpeace to violent, radical Islamic movements such as Al-Qaeda to the business-oriented transnational drug traders. The key element these organizations have in common is that they are not controlled by any nation or group of nations. They are literally free agents on the international scene and will interject themselves into international relations where and when they see fit, to meet their goals. They may seek something simple, such as involvement in elections. They may choose to influence elections through money, volunteering to support a candidate, or official endorsements of a candidate or position. At the other end of the spectrum, transnational entities may choose to support an insurgent uprising to gain control of a portion of a country. They may simply choose to assassinate key opponents. Today, These transnational organizations employ a variety of techniques and have an impact on national and international events that simply was not present prior to World War II. On the subnational level, we have numerous nations that lack states. Many of these groups fall either within a single state or straddle various states as a result of the artificial boundaries that evolved from the colonial era. Although these are not powerful organizations, they can play notable roles on the international scene. One only has to consider the impact of the Kurds, the Serbs, the Croats, the Palestinians, or the Irish Republican Army on recent events to see that, although relatively minor players, these subnational organizations can and do have impact. Perhaps the most powerful and least controlled new international players are the international financial markets. Although there were markets prior to World War II, their impact was small compared to today's markets. Then, market transactions took time, and the various nations could control many of these markets' assets. Today, billions of dollars, pounds, euros, or yen can be moved instantaneously to any of millions of locations. Further, the decision to move those assets is not made in any one place or by any identifiable group of people or organizations. These decisions are made by two networked entities that Thomas Friedman has labeled the electronic herd and the supermarkets. The electronic herd today consists of two basic groups. One group I call the shorthorn cattle. This includes all those people involved in the buying and selling of stocks, bonds, and currencies around the world, and who can and often do move their money around on a very short-term basis. The shorthorn cattle are currency traders, major mutual and pension funds, hedge funds, insurance companies, bank trading rooms and individual investors. They include everyone from Merrill Lynch to Credit Suisse to Fuji Bank to the Charles Schwab website, where anyone with a PC and a modem can trade online from his living room. The other group I call the longhorn cattle. These are the multinationals, the General Electrics, the General Motorses, the IBMs, the Intels, the Siemenses, which are increasingly involved in foreign direct investment, building factories around the world or striking international long-term production deals or alliances with overseas factories to make or assemble their products. I call them the longhorn cattle because they have to make longer-term commitments when they invest in a country. But even they now move in and out, like a herd, with surprising speed. 1. This electronic herd monitors international conditions on an hour-by-hour basis. If they determine that a state is creating conditions hostile to profits, they can punish that state severely via the market. Credit will simply not be available for states that fall into disfavor. Whether political leaders admit it or not, their freedom of action is distinctly limited by the herd. The second set of key economic players Friedman identifies, the supermarkets, are the big stock exchanges in major cities, according to University of Chicago globalization expert Saskia Sassen. By the end of 1997, 25 supermarkets controlled 83% of the world's equities under institutional management and accounted for roughly half of global market capitalization, around $20 trillion. This is 10 times the size of the US government's annual budget, and it moves worldwide based on the independent and essentially uncontrollable decisions of millions of individual decision makers. Although on the surface the markets seem to be purely economic, their impact is that of a powerful political player. This player can dictate trade policies, influence elections, determine interest rates, place limits on national social policy, decide acceptable banking practices, and drive many other activities of nations. Even the United States is not immune. Despite the United States' great size and dominant economy, the herd did not hesitate to rush from the market after the numerous revelations concerning CEO corruption and dishonest accounting practices. The sudden outflow of money from the market during July 2002 resurrected strong new regulatory legislation. Before the sudden descent of the Dow Jones average below 8,000, the administration and Congress had buried the new regulatory laws. The herd responded by driving the Dow down, and Congress acted swiftly to pass the legislation. Clearly, the international markets themselves are now a major player in all political and economic decisions made by rational governments. The cumulative effect of this proliferation of players on the international scene is a distinct reduction in the power and freedom of action of nations. Although they remain the primary players in international affairs, the wide variety of new players places restrictions on these states that simply did not exist at the beginning of World War II. The multitude of players also provides additional avenues for our enemies to influence U.S. policy. As great as the political changes have been, economically the shift has been even more distinct. Just prior to World War II, a nation's wealth was frequently measured in terms of tons of coal produced, tons of steel rolled, number of automobiles manufactured, all measures of an industrial power, with an emphasis on mechanical power. In fact, the fundamental sources of wealth in an industrial society were the raw materials and the manufacturing facilities that converted them to finished products. Mass production was the key to efficiency and to meeting customer demand. In a world of durable goods with long service lives, low cost and standardization were critical. Today, the most rapidly growing sector of the international economy is information. Unlike industrial plants, these wealth-generating assets are easily moved and are often part of geographically distributed networks in their day-to-day operations. Nations can no longer compel compliance from companies by threatening their physical assets simply because many of a company's most important assets exist only in cyberspace and can be moved anywhere in the world virtually instantaneously. Further complicating the allegiance of economic entities is that a fair percentage of wealth today is generated by using knowledge developed in one nation to build factories that exploit resources, people, raw materials, markets, in another, yet all involved know the commitment is not long-term. The relationship will continue only as long as it is advantageous economically. Finally, the stock markets ensure that ownership of any public corporation may well be distributed worldwide, with large and small stockholders having little or no interest in the political needs of the home country of the corporation they own. Warfare is coming to parallel this model. The knowledge of how to conduct an attack is developed in one country, then that knowledge is combined with the raw materials, personnel, and training available in other countries, which can include the target country, to create a weapon in the target country. Both the 9/11 and Madrid attacks were conducted using this approach. Further, ownership of the action may belong to contributors who are distributed around the world but provide funding to the terror networks planning the attack. In the past, it has been possible to at least intercept terrorist weapons at our borders. Now, the modern concept of manufacturing weapons in the target country means there are no materials to intercept. No longer can we as a nation recognize and intercept a weapon before it reaches our shores. Only the knowledge of the attack and the weapons cross our borders. All other materials can be purchased within our borders. Just as some elements of a knowledge-based economy move only knowledge and personnel across international boundaries, so do some practitioners of 4GW. Socially, prior to World War II, citizens of developed nations dealt almost exclusively with people from within their own country, and often just locally, within their own city or county. Although a limited number of businessmen had regular communication with foreigners, the vast majority of the citizens of even well-developed nations had little or no contact with foreigners. Communication was expensive, travel was time-consuming and very expensive. Only the wealthy few could travel abroad. The middle class relied on local newspapers, national news magazines, and radio for their information. Nation-states, like their economies, were hierarchical. Internally, information moved up and down, but internationally, information moved only at the top levels of society. In the undeveloped nations, citizens or, more commonly, peasants rarely traveled more than a day's journey from their place of birth. Their view of the world came almost exclusively from oral tradition and family beliefs. In contrast, today's communications revolution has completely changed how people get information. In the same way governments, businesses, and trade associations are becoming networks rather than hierarchies, so are relations between people of different states. Citizens of today's developed nations have virtually unlimited access to the people and ideas of other cultures. With the advent of cheap communications and transportation, international connections have multiplied exponentially. For the first time in history, it is easy for average residents of one state to develop strong interests and common bonds with those of other states. For instance, a member of Greenpeace in the American Northwest may have more in common with another Greenpeace member in Germany than with the logger who lives next door. Using email, websites, and inexpensive long distance, they may communicate more often with each other than with their neighbors. This has major implications for all government, but particularly for democracies. Although this free association may seem powerless, it was a purely volunteer effort by the International Committee to Ban Landmines, organized primarily over the Internet, that drove the treaty to ban landmines. Another purely volunteer effort created Linux as an alternate operating system to Microsoft. A volunteer effort organized over the Internet built the coalition of anti-globalization activists that shut down the WTO meeting in Seattle during the summer of 2001. The same technology that enables Greenpeace and the International Committee to Ban Landmines also facilitates organizations such as the Islamic fundamentalist groups. Even more challenging from a security point of view is that the people do not have to go out to establish these networks. They do not have to be in the same country or even be online at the same time. The old police technique of tracking illegal activity by watching certain places and certain people does not work when communication is carried out online. Although police agencies around the world are beginning to track some activity in cyberspace, the sheer volume makes it daunting. In a later chapter, we will explore how much of the new technology favors the terrorist rather than the government. In short, citizens of developed nations are no longer limited to living in a hierarchical nation-state. They can now live in a networked international community. At the other end of the spectrum, citizens of even the poorest nations have access to television and magazines that portray the riches of the developed world. Although a generation ago the most they could hope to see was the next village, now they can see Park Avenue. This creates a much greater sense of relative deprivation and unrest in those nations. Along with the Internet, it also eliminates the government's monopoly on information. No longer can any state assume its citizens will believe only what the government tells them. This unrest, combined with the artificial nature of the boundaries of many states, has resulted in the severe breakdown of order within many of these post-colonial nations. Often it has led to the effective, if not the official, dissolution of many of these creations of the colonial powers. The result has been the reversion to much earlier social organizations: tribal, clan, or gang. The result is a major change in whom we might fight and how they see a fight. In the last 100 years or so, Western nations have become accustomed to fighting disciplined, uniformed soldiers of another nation. Now we are faced with fighting warrior or clan societies. The difference between a soldier and a warrior is essential. Soldiers are disciplined members of a specific profession. As such, they are under the control of a political entity and do not have specific financial or social benefits from continuing to fight. Although there is increased prestige and opportunity for promotion during war, most professional soldiers will at least pay lip service to a preference for peace. In contrast, a warrior society thrives on and exists for war. Often, the young warrior has everything to lose, except his life, if he stops fighting. Consider the young clansman in Somalia. As a member of a fighting clan, he has prestige and income. They combine to give him access to money, food, property, and women. If he puts his weapons down, he loses that prestige and the income, and with them everything else. Although the risk of death from fighting is always present, it is actually less than the risk of death from starvation if he stops fighting. Unfortunately, most of these warrior societies' mechanisms for keeping violence to a manageable level are based on traditional systems. For instance, in Somalia, clan elders would meet and determine fines imposed on an individual or family who killed another during a camel raid. However, the advent of powerful new weapons has escalated the killing beyond the control of the old social systems. The young warriors have learned new techniques to employ the new weapons. Like all human organizations, they have adapted. This creates a major problem for Western soldiers facing such a warrior society. These societies have learned that pushing women and children to the front, even in close combat, will often neutralize the superior firepower of Western soldiers. Sometimes the women and children are armed, sometimes not. Further, women and children at the front shows that the entire society has mobilized against a perceived threat to its livelihood, territory, or customs. Even when the confrontation does not include weapons, warrior societies have learned that Western soldiers have trouble dealing with large numbers of women and children and have added them as a tactical tool when it creates an advantage. In sum, there has been an enormous social change from what Western forces faced at the beginning of World War II. The societies of rich nations have fragmented and are beginning to align by interests rather than nationality. Many poor nations have failed completely, with their populations breaking up into the tribes or clans that preceded the nation-state imposed by the colonial powers. Unfortunately, the tribal organizations were never designed to deal with the challenges inherent in a failed nation. Thus, many of the poor face little hope. In short, social changes since World War II have been extensive and wide-ranging. The cumulative changes in political, economic, and social arenas since World War II are clear and distinct. The changes in the technical area are overwhelming. Frankly, they are much too extensive, and too familiar to the reader, to explore in depth here. Still, consider the following examples. In 1940, the first computer had not even been developed. The first satellite was almost 20 years away. Television did not exist. Commercial aviation was in its infancy. Trans-Pacific flights took days. The total capacity of all transoceanic cable and phone lines was less than one of today's fiber optic cables. Further, as technology continues to evolve, it is just as rapidly reordering every aspect of our lives. The entirely new fields of complexity and network theory are changing how we see the world. Our understanding of biology is increasing at an ever faster pace. In each of these areas, the world has leapt ahead since World War II. It is intuitively obvious to any observer that almost unimaginable change has occurred in the last 60 years. Although not all sectors of a society evolve at the same rate, all are moving in the same direction. As we evolved into the industrial era, governments, business, and social organizations moved to a hierarchical structure that was often national in scale. In the same way, as we move into the information age, all sectors of society are becoming networked on an international scale. What is less obvious is that the rate of change has been accelerating, and not just over the last 60 years but over recorded history. Consider world population alone. It took from year 1 until 1800 to grow from 300 million to 1 billion. Yet the population doubled in only the next 150 years, reaching 2 billion by 1950. Then it tripled in a mere 50 years, reaching 6 billion by 2000. It took more than 1,700 years for the first democracy to evolve after Rome became an empire, yet the next 200 years saw democracy spread around the world. It took almost 100 years from the invention of the steam locomotive for it to become a central element of national economies. It took less than 25 years for the personal computer to do the same. It took less than 5 years for instant messaging to penetrate most societies. In warfare, change is also accelerating. It took hundreds of years from the development of the musket and cannon for first-generation warfare to evolve. Second-generation warfare evolved and peaked in the 100 years between Waterloo and Verdun. Third-generation warfare came to maturity in less than 25 years. Clearly, third-generation warfare cannot be the leading edge of war more than 60 years later. The next few chapters will outline how fourth-generation warfare has evolved and has dominated war since World War II.